Imagine being taken from your home at midnight. No charges, no lawyer, no explanation. Only a silent hallway. Only the sound of boots. And behind the steel door, a room designed not to break your bones, but to break your mind. Tonight, we uncover the real methods used by the KGB, one of the most feared secret police forces of the 20th century. After World War II, the Soviet leadership wanted absolute control, not just over borders or armies, but over thoughts, over loyalty, over the invisible battlefield inside every citizen's mind. And to maintain that control, they needed a force that didn't simply enforce the law. It enforced obedience. That force was the KGB. But the story doesn't start with the KGB. It began earlier, with its predecessors, the NKVD and the MGB, organizations responsible for mass surveillance, political arrests, and the vast network of forced labor camps known as the Gulag. These agencies shaped a culture where suspicion was a survival skill and trust was a luxury few could afford. By 1954, the KGB Komitet Gosударственной Безопасности, the Committee for State Security, was officially created. On paper, it was an intelligence and security service. In reality, it became the all-seeing eye of the Soviet state. To Americans during the Cold War, the KGB was a shadowy enemy, spies, double agents, and cloak-and-dagger missions across Berlin, Washington, and London. But inside the Soviet Union, the KGB played a very different role. It wasn't the agent in a trench coat that scared people the most. It was the idea that anyone could be watching you, a teacher, a co-worker, even a family friend. Millions of files were kept on ordinary citizens, who they talked to, what books they read, what jokes they told. A wrong word at a dinner table could quietly turn into a report, and a report could turn into an arrest. People lived with an unspoken rule: if you want to stay safe, keep your secrets, keep your head down, and never trust the walls. Because everyone knew the same truth: if the KGB believed you were a threat politically, ideologically, or even accidentally, you could disappear without warning. No trial, no explanation, no goodbye. This was a world where fear wasn't just a feeling. It was a system, a weapon, a way to shape an entire society. And behind this atmosphere of paranoia stood the methods. The KGB perfected methods designed not to break bones, but to break certainty, identity, and the human spirit. Those methods are what we uncover next. For millions of Soviet citizens, fear didn't begin inside a prison cell. It began at home. Imagine it's past midnight. Your apartment is dark. Your family is asleep. The stairwell outside your door is silent, as it always is at that hour. Then a knock. Not loud, not angry, just firm, and unmistakably official. Every Soviet citizen knew that knock. They called it the midnight knock. It was the moment your life could change forever. The KGB rarely came during the day. Daylight meant witnesses, questions, attention. But darkness gave them everything they needed: secrecy, control, and fear. Behind the door, you would often find two men, sometimes three. No uniforms, no badges, no explanations. That was what made them terrifying. You never knew who they were. Sometimes they wore plain coats. Sometimes they looked like regular workers. Sometimes they didn't say a single word until you opened the door. And if you hesitated, they would enter anyway. Arrest warrants weren't required. Charges weren't explained. Your family wasn't told where you were going. The KGB followed what many survivors called the disappearance protocol. Step 1. Remove the individual quietly. Step 2. Erase any public trace. Step 3. Control all information surrounding the arrest. Neighbors would wake up the next morning and see only one detail: a dark car with no license plates parked under the street lamp. And by dawn, it would be gone. Inside those unmarked cars, usually black Volgas, the real journey began. The target was seated between two officers, hands often shaking, mind racing, heart pounding. No one spoke. Even the engine felt too loud for the silence inside. The destination was almost always the same. Lubyanka, a massive stone building in the center of Moscow, built like a fortress. Part headquarters, part prison, part interrogation center. A place so feared that people would cross the street just to avoid walking on the same side of the sidewalk. Survivors later said that being driven toward Lubyanka felt like entering the belly of a beast, a place where light and truth did not exist. The moment the car stopped, the officers would escort the prisoner through side doors, back entrances, or underground hallways designed to prevent anyone from seeing who was brought in. There were no public records of your arrival, no right to call a lawyer, no message to your family. You simply vanished into the system, absorbed into a bureaucracy designed to make you feel as though the world had forgotten you. And that was the point for the KGB. The arrest wasn't just about taking your body. It was about taking your certainty, your identity, your control. Because once fear takes root, once you lose your sense of time, space, and hope, interrogation becomes much easier. And behind the thick walls of Lubyanka, the next stage began, a room engineered for one purpose: to break the human mind. When the heavy doors of Lubyanka shut behind you, the world outside disappears. No sunlight, no noise, no sense of direction. The KGB didn't rely on dramatic torture chambers with chains and iron hooks. They didn't need them. They had something far more effective, a room designed to quietly dismantle the human mind. Survivors described the walk to the interrogation chambers as a descent into another world. Long corridors with yellowish lights, walls that swallowed sound, guards who stared straight ahead, expressionless, like they'd seen this process too many times and no longer cared to remember faces. Eventually, a door opened. And there it was, the room. It was never big, often no larger than a small office. Cold concrete walls, sometimes painted a dull green or gray. A single lamp overhead, angled downward, its bright light aimed directly at the prisoner's face. The brightness wasn't accidental. It was the first weapon. Because when your eyes can't adjust, when you can't see the room clearly, your mind begins to imagine what might be in the shadows. In the center sat a metal chair, bolted to the floor, straight back, no padding. The kind of chair that becomes torture after hours of sitting in it. Across from the chair, a desk, perfectly clean except for a thin file and a cup of cold tea. And behind that desk sat the interrogator, not a monster, not a movie villain, just a man in a suit, usually calm, polite, and eerily patient. That was part of the strategy. If the room was the trap, he was the spider. The KGB used what one former officer called the interrogation triad: fear, isolation, exhaustion. Fear came from the unknown. You didn't know why you were taken, who reported you, what evidence they had, or what would happen next. Every unanswered question became a tool. Isolation came from being cut off from the world. No family, no lawyer, often no other voices for days. Just the interrogator and the echo of your own thoughts. And then came exhaustion. The silent, creeping force that broke more prisoners than anything else. The interrogators didn't rush. They didn't shout. They let time do the work. The room was kept cold, just enough to keep your body shaking. The chair was uncomfortable by design. The lamp burned into your vision until you couldn't tell if it was day or night. Survivors said that after just a few hours, their sense of reality began to blur. After a few days, the room became the whole world. And after enough sleepless nights, even the strongest minds began to slip. That was when the interrogator leaned forward, folded his hands, and spoke in a soft, steady voice. "Let's talk. Tell us everything. And often, they did that not because of violence, not because of threats, but because the room had stripped away every defense they had. But this was only the beginning. The KGB had perfected psychological methods that could push a person to confess, comply, or break without ever leaving a mark. Once the interrogator had you in that cold, dim room, the real battle began not against your body, but against your sense of reality. The KGB believed that pain faded, but confusion, fear, and exhaustion could reshape a person forever. They didn't need loud tools or dramatic violence. Their weapons were quiet, invisible, and devastating. Point 1. Sleep deprivation, turning days into nightmares. Simplest method was also one of the most effective. Don't let the prisoner sleep. No screaming, no beatings, just constant, relentless interruption. Guards would switch shifts every few hours, keeping the questioning alive like a slow-burning fire. The lights stayed on bright, harsh, impossible to escape. If the prisoner closed their eyes too long, an officer would tap the desk, shift their chair, or ask a sudden question, not aggressive, just enough to stop sleep from ever arriving. After 24 hours, your thoughts became foggy. After 48, you couldn't trust your own memory. After 72, people began to hallucinate. And once the mind starts inventing things that aren't real, it becomes much easier for an interrogator to direct the story. 2. The White Room. Erasing the world. Some prisoners described a place that felt like a scene from a psychological experiment. No shadows, no color, no sounds. Just white walls, white floors, and a single chair. This wasn't a torture chamber. It was a sensory vacuum. Your brain is built to react to stimuli: motion, light, sound. But in the White Room, there was none. After just a few hours, prisoners couldn't tell whether they were awake or dreaming. Some lost their sense of time. Some forgot why they were being held. Some forgot who they were. And when you lose yourself, it becomes very easy for someone else to rewrite your story. 3. Isolation. The box. For others, the KGB used small isolation cells so tight you couldn't lie down fully or stretch your arms. The goal wasn't to crush the body, it was to crush the concept of time. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like days. And every passing second chipped away at confidence, at resistance, at hope. One former prisoner said, "After a week in that cell, I would have confessed to sinking the Titanic if they asked." 4. Threat simulation. The sharpest blade, but the most powerful method, wasn't physical or environmental. It was words. The interrogator would lean in and quietly say things like, "We know where your wife works. We know your son's school. Cooperate, and they stay safe." Sometimes it wasn't even true. But fear doesn't care about truth. Fear only needs possibility. This technique broke more prisoners than any cold cell or sleepless night ever could. 5. Good cop, bad cop. Soviet style. Hollywood didn't invent this method, intelligence agencies perfected it. The KGB was especially skilled. The bad cop might be silent for hours, staring, letting tension build. Then he'd slam a file on the table, accuse the prisoner of lying, threaten a harsher fate. Moments later, the good cop would enter. Soft voice, warm smile, a cigarette, a cup of tea. "I can help you," he'd say, "but you must help me first." To a sleep-deprived, terrified prisoner, that kindness felt like a lifeline. They clung to it, trusted it, and slowly they opened up. 6. The question storm, drowning in details. Sometimes interrogations lasted 8, 10, even 12 hours straight. Not violent, just endless. The same questions repeated dozens of times. Dates, names, locations, trivial details. And if one answer changed even slightly, the interrogator smiled and said, "Aha, so you lied." Most people eventually broke. Not because they were guilty, But because the human mind simply isn't built to endure that kind of pressure, by the time these methods ran their course, prisoners were exhausted, disoriented, and desperate for the nightmare to end. And that was when confessions, real or forced, were written, signed, and catalogued inside the walls of Lubyanka. Truth wasn't discovered. It was manufactured, carefully, methodically, piece by piece. But the story doesn't end here. Because the KGB still had another layer to their system: the prisons themselves, the punishment cells, and the physical methods designed to push a prisoner even further. By the time a prisoner reached this stage, the mind was already weakened, tired, confused, desperate for something solid. Even if that something was pain. But unlike the brutality of the Gestapo or other wartime secret police, the KGB preferred methods that left no visible marks, no proof, no trail. To the outside world, a prisoner looked fine. Inside, they were collapsing. The techniques you're about to hear were documented in declassified files, survivor memoirs, and court testimonies. They were real, but intentionally designed to stay in visible. Stress positions, pain without touch. The simplest method looked harmless from the outside. A prisoner might be told to stand with their nose an inch from a wall, or to kneel on a hard surface, or to sit on a small stool without moving for hours. These positions didn't break bones. They broke endurance. 5 minutes felt manageable. 20 minutes became torture. An hour felt like knives in the joints. But when the door opened and the interrogator returned, he would act surprised. "You look uncomfortable. Why don't you just cooperate?" The pain didn't need force. It needed time. The cold cell, the Siberian room. Not every prisoner was sent here. Only the ones who resisted the longest. The cold cell was exactly what it sounded like. A room kept just above freezing, with concrete floors and no blankets. Sometimes guards would lightly spray water onto the floor so that a prisoner's body heat slowly evaporated it, drawing warmth straight from their skin. It wasn't dramatic. No ice, no frostbite, no visible injuries, just a slow, creeping cold that made the body shake uncontrollably and the mind beg for warmth, for rest, for the nightmare to stop. Even a short stay here was enough to break some of the toughest individuals. The conveyor belt endless interrogation. Another method involved no cell at all, just a chair, a table, and rotating officers. Interrogator 1 would question the prisoner for 2 hours. Then he'd stand up calmly, leave. And Interrogator 2 would take his place. Then Interrogator 3. Shifts changed. The clock moved. The prisoner remained. This process could last 8, 10, even 12 hours. Sometimes without a break. The goal wasn't to hurt the prisoner physically. The goal was exhaustion so deep that a confession, any confession, felt like the only escape. One survivor described it like this: "It wasn't brutality. It was drowning. Drowning in questions. The psychological edge. Even when physical pressure was used, it was always paired with psychological tactics. A guard might offer a blanket, only to take it away moments later. An interrogator might promise a warm meal, only if the prisoner told the truth. Small, simple comforts became powerful tools. To a man freezing in the cold cell, a cup of hot tea could feel like salvation. To a woman forced to kneel for hours, the chance to stretch her legs felt like mercy. And mercy, when controlled by the interrogator, became another weapon. By the time these phases were complete, very few prisoners still believed they could resist. Most didn't know what day it was, what time it was, or whether anyone even knew where they were. They were ready for the next stage, the prisons, the punishment cells, and the long-term system designed to erase resistance completely. Those places had names that echoed across the Soviet Union: Lubyanka, Lefortovo, Butyrka, each one a chapter in the story of fear. When a prisoner left the interrogation room, many believed the worst was over. They were wrong. The KGB's power didn't end at Lubyanka's basement. It extended into a network of prisons designed not just to hold people, but to reshape them. These prisons were more than buildings. They were factories of silence, each with its own reputation, its own history, its own methods. Lubyanka, the nerve center of fear, most prisoners didn't enter Lubyanka through the grand front entrance that tourists see today. They entered through side doors, underground garages, or narrow hallways where fluorescent lights flickered and guards didn't speak. Deep inside, Lubyanka was divided into layers, administration floors above, interrogation rooms in the middle, and detention cells hidden in the lower levels. Survivors said the walls themselves seemed to listen. Every cell was small, cold, and perfectly controlled. Meals arrived at irregular times so prisoners couldn't track the hours. Lights were kept on or off unpredictably to disorient them further. Some cells had no windows. Others had windows so high and small, they showed only a thin slice of sky, just enough to remind you that freedom existed somewhere else, not above all. Lubyanka was a place of waiting. Waiting for the next interrogation. Waiting for a verdict you couldn't influence. Waiting to be moved somewhere worse. Butyrka prison, the holding chamber, if Lubyanka was the trap. Butyrka was the waiting room of despair, built in the 1700s and expanded over centuries. Butyrka became one of the Soviet Union's largest pretrial detention centers. It was always overcrowded, sometimes with 3 times more prisoners than it was designed to hold. Cells meant for 10 held 30. Bunk beds were stacked 3 high. Ventilation was poor, and the air felt heavy, stale, and almost metallic. Prisoners slept shoulder to shoulder. Privacy did not exist. Silence was rare, but the worst part wasn't the noise or the crowd. It was the unpredictability. One morning you might be told you're being released. The next you might be moved to a punishment cell, or transferred to another prison hundreds of miles away. No explanations. No timelines. Just endless uncertainty. Lefortovo, where order became oppression. Leforto prison, on the other hand, was the opposite of Butyrka. It wasn't chaotic. It was precise. Cells were arranged in long, narrow corridors where even footsteps sounded disciplined. Guards walked on carpet so prisoners wouldn't hear them approach. Surveillance was constant through peepholes, through floor-level slots, even through vents. Prisoners were moved only when the hallways were cleared, so they'd never see another inmate. This wasn't just isolation. It was engineered loneliness. One former detainee said, in Lefortovo, you began to wonder if other prisoners even existed, or if you were the last one left. The punishment cells across all these prisons. One feature was shared, the punishment cell. Sometimes called the freezer, sometimes the basement. These were small, bare rooms where temperatures dropped and hope followed. A prisoner might be placed there for hours or days. No bedding, no light, just darkness or cold, or both. The purpose wasn't physical suffering alone. It was the message, you are not in control. We are a system, not an accident individually. Each prison was terrifying. Together, they formed a perfectly engineered system. Arrest created shock. Interrogation created confusion. Prisons created helplessness. And by the time a prisoner emerged, if they ever did, they were forever changed. But despite the fear these places inspired, some people survived. Some even walked out of these prisons and told the world what they had seen. Their stories would help expose the inner workings of the KGB and change how history remembered this dark chapter. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many believed the era of secret police brutality had ended. Yet the legacy of the KGB's interrogation system continues to echo across history, not only in the countries it once controlled, but in the global conversation about human rights, state power, and the limits of government secrecy. And this is where the story takes a darker, more reflective turn, because the KGB didn't just suppress dissent. They shaped an entire culture of fear, a system where millions learned from childhood that silence was safer than honesty, that trust could be fatal, and that the state always watched. For many former Soviet citizens, the KGB wasn't a faceless agency. It was the knock on the door at 3 a.m. It was the neighbor who vanished and was never spoken of again. It was the whispered warnings given to children. Don't repeat what you hear at home. How we know the truth today after the fall of the USSR. Historians finally gained access to some KGB archives, not all, but enough to reveal the internal machinery of interrogations, the memos outlining psychological disruption techniques, the reports detailing strategic punishments, and the testimonies of both survivors and former officers who finally decided to speak. None of these documents read like spy fiction. They read like a manual for controlling an entire population, step by step. Generation after generation, modern parallels and lessons for American viewers. The story of the KGB isn't just distant Cold War history. It's a warning, because when a government builds a system where secrecy outweighs accountability, when agencies operate without oversight, abuses don't just happen, they become inevitable. Today, many former Soviet states continue to grapple with this legacy. Some struggle to rebuild trust between citizens and government. Others, critics argue, revive tactics that feel uncomfortably familiar. And every time a journalist is silenced, every time an opposition figure disappears, every time fear is used as a tool of power, people remember the old KGB methods not as history, but as a ghost that never truly left. Why this history still matters for the audience watching today, especially in the US. This story serves one purpose: to remind us that freedom is fragile. And the greatest danger is believing it could never happen here. The Soviet Union did not begin as a nation of fear. It became one, slowly, quietly, under the weight of a secret police force whose power was allowed to grow unchecked. And once that system was fully built, it took 7 decades and the collapse of an empire to break it. Closing image: imagine standing in one of the old KGB interrogation rooms today. Many have been preserved as museums. The heavy door, the single chair bolted to the floor, the walls padded not for comfort, but to mute screams. You don't need to see an interrogator in the room. The silence alone tells the story. A story of a system built on fear, and of why remembering it is the only way to ensure we never allow it to be built again. Throughout history, secret police forces have inspired fear, but not all operated in the same way. The Gestapo, Germany's infamous secret police during World War II, relied on overt physical violence. Their methods were brutal, direct, and often publicized through terror. Prisoners were beaten, interrogated harshly, and the pain was immediate and visible. The Gestapo wanted obedience through shock and horror. The KGB, by contrast, was far more subtle. Their approach was psychological warfare. They didn't need to leave scars or bones broken to achieve total control. They mastered fear, uncertainty, and exhaustion, tools that could wear down the strongest minds without leaving a mark. Where the Gestapo sought immediate confession, the KGB aimed to reshape reality itself for the prisoner. Hours, days, even weeks of deprivation, isolation, and calculated psychological pressure slowly eroded identity, creating compliance. And yet, both shared a terrifying power: the ability to make an entire society silent. A single knock at midnight, a single whispered accusation, a single report could change a life forever. Understanding this comparison isn't about sensationalism, it's about perspective. It shows us how fear can be engineered differently across time and place. It shows us that control isn't always physical. Sometimes the mind itself is the battlefield. So why does this history matter today? Why should an American audience care about methods developed by a Soviet secret police decades ago? Because the story of the KGB reminds us that freedom is fragile. It reminds us that power unchecked can shape lives, not through war, but through fear. And it reminds us that vigilance is not optional, it is necessary. The survivors of Lubyanka, Butyrka, and Lefortovo walked out carrying stories of endurance and warning. Figures like Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Nathan Sharansky not only survived, they exposed the machinery of fear to the world. Their accounts remind us that even in the darkest systems, the human spirit can endure. For viewers today, these stories serve as cautionary tales. Governments, institutions, and leaders have power, but so do the people who demand transparency, accountability, and human rights. Remembering the KGB's methods isn't just about learning history. It's about understanding the cost of silence, the weight of fear, and the value of freedom. Imagine standing in the cold, silent rooms of Lubyanka today. The chair is still there, bolted to the floor. The lamp still casts its harsh light. The walls, once witnesses to countless interrogations, now serve as reminders that history can repeat itself if we are not careful. History whispers a lesson. Fear is powerful, but knowledge is stronger. Understanding the KGB's dark methods helps ensure that the next generation sees through the shadows and chooses light, not terror,